We live in a very youth-oriented society and culture. In some ways, it's sort of paradoxical because we live at a time when the average age in this country is older than ever, and that is, if you take the sum total of the population and you average the ages together, in years past, the average age of this country was considerably younger because, of course, families were larger and the number of children factored in. A far greater percentage of the population of the nation was under 20 than is the case today. In fact, we, by comparison to certain nations, particularly some of the nations with burgeoning population growth in Central and South America and portions of Africa and even some areas of Asia, but particularly Central America and Africa, where the average age may be as young as 16 or 17, if you take the total population of the country. Yet, at a time in decades past when the average age of this country was considerably younger, because the average age right now in the United States is somewhere in the mid-30s. In other words, if you were to take that half of the people in the country are older than that and half the people are younger, that average age has been moving up. Back in the early part of this century, the average age was on down, turn of the century, the average age was probably closer to about 20. That about half the people in the country were older than that, than early 20s, and half the people were younger. Today, that's moved on up to about mid-30s. Yet, the paradox is that as the average age of this country has increased, and as there are more people, a greater percentage of people who are older, who are in what would be termed middle age and old age, as opposed to children and young adults, as that percentage has increased and as the percentage of those who are older has increased, yet we have paradoxically become more and more of a youth-oriented culture. That there has been a tremendous emphasis on youth that has increasingly developed. I'll show you even some prophetic references to it. Now, some of this, of course, was during the what's called the baby boom years right after World War II. There was, of course, as most of the young men in our nation, having been away from home, away from their families during several years of World War II, the return of this group of young men back to the nation at the end of World War II and the demobilization of our military began a process that certainly the latter part of 1945 and particularly 1946, 47, 48, 49 saw what was called a baby boom. In other words, a gigantic number of babies being born in those years as young men were coming back home and either coming back to a wife or were getting married as they got out of the service and establishing their families, having been gone and away for several years. And so there was a gigantic jump in the number of babies that were born in this country, and that has had its effect just in terms of the demographics of the numbers and the percentages. But in spite of all that, there is an emphasis and an increasing, it has increased in years past, in recent years, this emphasis on youth. In fact, there's really a multi-billion-dollar industry that is dedicated to helping people look and feel younger. You know, there are all sorts of approaches to it. They're health-oriented approaches. They're books, they're diets, they're spas, they're all sorts of things that relate to a health-oriented approach of being younger and feeling younger and looking younger. They're cosmetic approaches, whether you're talking about anything from hair dye and makeup to wigs to you name it, that represent an approach. They're medical approaches, to the subject of trying to look younger and feel younger. That would include everything from plastic surgery and hormone shots and all sorts of things. There are various approaches, whether it's health-oriented or medical-oriented or simply cosmetic-oriented. But in spite of all these attempts, you see, to look younger and feel younger and somehow give the appearance of being younger, people keep getting older. And, of course, there's only one alternative to getting older. You know, there is one alternative, but it's the alternative nobody wants. There's only one way to avoid getting older, and that's dying young. I don't really know of any other way to avoid getting older. And that being the only alternative, nobody wants that alternative. You know, they don't. People fight and resist against getting older, and yet they don't like the alternative. So what can they do? Well, we've got various problems in this country right now. Many of them related to the healthcare industry and to the burgeoning and ever increasing amount of the GNP that is being spent on healthcare in this country. Social Security crisis because many ways of government mismanagement of the Social Security Trust Fund. But the nursing home industry is something that has virtually come into existence in recent years. It was something that, for all purposes, was almost non-existent prior to World War II, and it has become a real growth industry. It's burgeoning numbers in nursing homes. A lot of people view old age as something that is virtually a disease. Yet, the reality of it is, when you stop to consider, God designed the aging process. You ever thought about that? God designed the fact that we age and the things that go together and characterize age. The Bible has quite a bit to say about age, about old age, about the role of older people in society. And it's a subject that is often overlooked, but is something that the Bible focuses on quite a bit. And I think it's appropriate that we take stock of some of what God has to say and understand a little more clearly why He says what He says, what He says, and why He says it. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 3, there is a prophecy concerning our time and our day, concerns the collapse and the fall of the Israelitish nations, the United States and British Commonwealth nations. It's been perhaps quite a while since a sermon has been given on that particular subject, and it's something that I hope to address a little later on in the summer in terms of going into a lot of the background on that. But just to, without going through and getting off on a different subject and trying to prove that right now, that this is what is addressed in Isaiah 3, let's look here as we have a prophecy concerning the end time, as most of Isaiah does concern the end time. And it talks about the fact that there are various things that are going to be removed. It's going to be taken away, the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water. So there's a reference to a coming famine. There is a reference in verse 2 to the mighty men, the men of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, the ancient. All of these being taken away, that there's going to be a dearth of food and water. There's going to be a dearth of leadership, of capable, competent leadership. And certainly we see much of that vacuum in the country today. He says, verse 4, by comparison I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. The people shall be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. So God talks about a society being turned upside down, and He says people will be oppressed, every one by another. Every one by another, every one by his neighbor. So He describes a society that is rent with strife, that is rent with unrest, that is rent with all sorts of trouble and distortion. We've certainly seen that We see it whether it has to do in everyday life or whether it has to do in the rising crime rate, the rising extent of violent crime, of crimes against property. The fact that many of us, those of us who are certainly middle-aged and older, grew up in a time when it was uncommon to lock your doors at night. There are a lot of you here that the biggest lock you had on your door was the hook and eye on the screen. That was more to keep the dog from coming in and going out than it was anything else. And there are a lot of you that remember that, and for whom that was the case. That was for us. It is for very, very few anymore. Very, very few anymore. People shall be oppressed, everyone by another, everyone by his neighbor. All sorts of strife and difficulty and problems of this sort. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. I think one of the greatest characteristics of our society in recent years has been the increasing level of disrespect that characterizes society. I talked with an individual who's been a school teacher for over 25 years, was talking with her, and just asked her the question, what is the biggest change you've noticed in your years of teaching? Now approaching 30 years of teaching, you've observed a lot over that period of time. What's the biggest difference you notice? And very quickly she responded that the biggest change that she noticed in her years of teaching was the level of respect, the attitude that was displayed by the students toward the teachers and toward those in authority. That there was a dramatic difference over the course of almost 3 decades in the level of respect that was shown. Well, this is what it says, the child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient. So here is an attitude of disrespect toward those that are older. Ways of expressing themselves, just a whole attitude of respect and of deference to authority. One of the things that increasingly characterizes our age and our society. Now, there are various things that have contributed to that, and I don't have time to get off into all of them today. I've commented on some, even in recent sermons. Well, it goes through and talks about this dearth of leadership, and the fact of people trying to. The time is going to come when people are trying to shove one another to the forefront, and nobody's going to want the job because they're going to see things falling apart. These verses partially have come about. We've seen a little bit of it, but there are things certainly left to happen. One of the things this year that made the presidential primary selection process a little different was that many, particularly in the Democratic Party, many of the leaders all hesitated to get into the race. They were a little bit hesitant to get in because nobody was sure what was going to happen, and they figured that it was not going to be successful. So they were sort of all hanging back. Well, what is addressed here in verse 6 and 7 is not so much that people are hanging back because they're afraid they're going to be defeated, but a matter that as things start to unravel and fall apart and the insolubility of some of these things become more and more apparent, that nobody's going to want to be in the position of having to take responsibility for it. And this has not fully come to pass, but it shall. So it goes on here in verse 11. It says, woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hand shall be given him. People ultimately will reap what they have sown. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they which lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your path. And the Lord stands up to plead and stands to judge the people. And it goes through and talks about the fact of God's intervention. So we're looking at things that are to characterize society. And he said, as for my people, children are their oppressors, women rule over them. So he talks about a society where things turn upside down, a society that is not based and not predicated on the values and the order that God has established. So he talks about this sort of thing and this attitude toward of youth toward age that would come to characterize our nation in the end time. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul writes, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come, dangerous times. Men shall be lovers of their own selves." The first and primary characteristic, we're told, is going to be a self-oriented society. A self-oriented society. Now, people have always, when it says lovers of their own selves, the focus is a very self-focus. Covetous, and that certainly, again, characterizes our materialistic society. Boasters, proud, blasphemers. I don't know of a time in certainly recent history that has been more characterized by just the wholesale disregard for any sort of reverence. The blasphemers, the craziness of it is that, well, I'll give you an example. There's a case right now before the Supreme Court. It involves a junior high school graduation, an 8th grade graduation that was taking place, and there was a rabbi whose son was in this particular class, this 8th grade class, and he was invited to give the invocation there as they had the service or the graduation ceremony. Well, there's a case that's wound up all the way to the Supreme Court because there were those who were violently upset about the fact that God's name was invoked, but there was a prayer that was given. Oh, that was terrible. Now, if somebody had gotten up and given a speech and had laced it with all sorts of vulgar words or used 4-letter words and taken God's name in vain, do you think that if you'd tried to stop that, they would have accused you of censorship? We've got a controversy going on right now, the so-called trash lyrics bill that simply says that records that contain vulgar and obscene material and things of this sort have to be labeled as such, and they can't be sold to minors. And our governor is very, very concerned about censorship. It just strikes him as terrible that we would censor anything. And, of course, the truth of the matter is all sorts of things are restricted to minors. You can't sell alcohol and cigarettes to them, at least not legally. There's certain movies that they're not supposed to be able to go in and see, again, not legally. Certain things, you're not admitted without a parent or guardian unless you are above a certain age. And they're labeled. But we're, real concerned about not censoring anything. On the one hand, blasphemy, we can't censor blasphemy. But if somebody gets up and offers a prayer, if you mention God's name in reverence, that's terrible. That needs to be banned. If you want to get up and curse the air blue and use God's name in all sorts of blasphemous vulgarity, well, that's protected. Now, you tell me that a society that has that distorted, that can't distinguish, one of the things that's mentioned in the prophets is woe unto them that call good evil and evil good. They get it mixed up. It's upside down. Somehow blasphemy is considered protected and reverence is considered terrible. Oh, that's un-American. You can't mention God's name in reverence, but if you want to get up and curse and yell out curse words and 4-letter words and all sorts of things like that, well, that's okay. There's a distortion. Men will be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents. Unthankful, unholy, disobedient to parents. An attitude, again, that expresses, that is very characteristic, an attitude of a society in rebellion. This was not the design that God intended for society. When you go back to the fundamental law of God given in Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments, God introduces Himself in the first commandment that He is the eternal God. He is the one that delivered His people, and they were to have no gods before Him. Nothing was to come before Him. They were not to make idols, graven images, things that were to be used as representations of God, to be venerated and worshipped, because those things really serve to distort and to create barriers that block us off from the true God, who is a spirit and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. The third commandment had to do with reverencing God's name, showing honor and reverence to the name of God, because God is God and is to be treated with reverence and respect. Fourthly, we were to remember the day that God has set apart and sanctified and made holy. And the fifth commandment in Exodus 20 verse 12 was, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the eternal your God gives you. Honor your father and your mother. Now, what's involved here? You know, God considered this pretty important. He included it in with the Ten Commandments, right in there with not worshiping idols and keeping the Sabbath, and right in there with not killing, not committing adultery or stealing or lying or coveting. You know, God places these matters on a very important plane. So He says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the eternal your God shall give you. Now that ought to tell us something too. There is a promise that is included here. There is a statement, there is an explanation of why it is important to honor our parents. There's a promise that's included here. Now that's referred to back in the book of Ephesians. Let's just notice back here very quickly. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long upon the earth. So, here, this is singled out that honor is to be given, and it's singled out as the first commandment with promise. So this is a commandment that holds out a promise, and it has to do with dwelling long, with living long. It has to do, in Exodus 20, verse 12, it has to do specifically with that you might dwell long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. A society that is based upon honor and respect is a society that has stability and that will endure. You see, that's the bottom line of it. A society that's based on respect and honor has stability. A society that's stable has a basis of enduring. It has the basis of lasting. A society based on disrespect is a society that will turn inward upon itself, a society that will simply destroy itself, a society that has a self-destruct mechanism. You know, that will turn inward, and in effect the society will eat and devour itself. That's what we see going on in this country right now. The civil strife and unrest that has characterized our nation on and off for the last 2.5 decades or so, maybe a little longer than that, closer to 3 decades. The civil strife and unrest that has characterized our society during this period has been on a scale that has been unprecedented prior to that. And it is very directly tied in with attitudes of honor and respect. Now, The family is the starting place. You see, the first authority figures to which a child is introduced. First authority figures are the parents. They're your father and your mother. Those are the first ones that you meet or that to whom you're introduced. And the attitude that is developed in the home is going to carry over. It's going to carry over to the school. It's going to carry over to relationships in the neighborhood and in the community. It's going to carry over to relationships all up and down in society. And when this attitude of honor and respect is not learned in the home, there's going to be strife, there's going to be unrest, there's going to be all sorts of problems that are certainly going to result in the consequence of a society that is not stable and does not have a basis of enduring. So when God said, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you, He is holding out the fact that the key to a society that will endure, the key for a society that will endure is a society that is based upon respect and honor. Because when that is destroyed, when that doesn't exist, the whole basis of people being able to live together in any sort of way, in any sort of way that's peaceful, that's harmonious, is destroyed. Because when there is a lack of respect, it carries through in every sort of way. And when there is not respect that is extended on the basis of something of this sort, then what you wind up with is sort of a law of the jungle mentality, that whoever is the biggest, the strongest, has the most powerful, he's the one that everybody else gets out of the way of. That's the law of the jungle. That's the way savage animals are. The animal that is the biggest, the strongest, the most terrible, the most fearsome, all of the others, in that sense, defer to that one. God didn't design human beings to be that way, that deference is to be given just automatically, that the one to be deferred to is the one that's the tallest, the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful, that has the biggest gun. God established a society where honor and respect was given to those who are older. Now, when children are young, when they're small, their parents certainly are able to dominate because they're superior in terms of strength and size and things of this sort. But honor your parents is not a command that has an age limit on it. It doesn't say honor your parents until you turn 20, which was, of course, the age of majority as God established it. In ancient Israel, they were not counted in the census as adults until those who were counted in the census as adults were those who were 20 years old and upward. But the fifth commandment doesn't have an age limit on it. It doesn't say honor your parents until you turn 20, then spit in their eye. It didn't say that at all. So the point of that is that for most of your life, as the years go by, your parents get older, that the honor and the respect that goes to those who are older in society doesn't go to them because somehow they're bigger, they're stronger, they're more powerful. It goes to them by virtue of the position that they occupy as the elders of a society. God established a society where those who were given honor were those who were elders, not necessarily those who were physically the strongest and the most powerful. And that is really the basis on which civilization exists, because when things revert back down to the law of the jungle, that respect is only given, is equated with fear, and you're only fearful of somebody that you think can do more damage to you than you can to them, then you really don't have the basis of any sort of a society that will endure. Instead of respect and instead of honor, you've got animosity, you've got resentment, you've got fear, you've got all of these pervasive characteristics that are just setting the stage for a society turning in upon itself. The fifth commandment, the commandment to honor our parents, sets the stage for a society that is predicated upon honor and respect. And these are factors that have greatly been diminished and lost in our age, that and have had a very detrimental effect on society. You know, the emphasis on that, as it goes back to a period, I think particularly you find this emphasis in the 60s, that was in effect, look, your parents don't know anything. You've got all the answers. You're the ones that have the answers. And when you look at the civil unrest and the civil strife that became pervasive throughout this period of the mid to late 60s, or the decade of the 60s and the 70s, on into the 70s, you have one of the most serious consequences was that it was a generational matter. It was a younger generation who were encouraged to look with contempt on an older generation, to look on them with disrespect, and it has created problems in terms of relationships in our society that we're reaping the consequences of right now. When God got ready to deal with the nation of Israel, for instance, at the time when He proposed the covenant, in whether it's in the book of Exodus, when God got ready to propose the covenant with Israel in Exodus 19:7, Moses came and he called for the elders of the people, and he laid before their faces all the words which the Lord commanded him. He called for the elders of the people. He called for those who were older and who were looked to in a leadership capacity. And this was certainly an important attribute and characteristic, because by virtue of age and experience, those who were considered the elders of society were considered as, to a great extent, responsible. Deuteronomy 31:28. Moses said, "Gather unto me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in their ears, and call heaven and earth to record against them." Gather to me all the elders of your tribes. Here were those who were older, those who were in that sense responsible. It talks about in the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, a reference to, of course, the description here of what we term the virtuous woman, makes reference to her husband, and it says in Proverbs 31:23, "Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land." Now, the gates were the sort of the places of public concourse. The business was transacted here, legal business, commercial business. It was an area that people tended to gather and to discuss matters of import. Decisions were made, community consensus was arrived, and those who sat there were the elders of the land, those who were older, those who had gained experience in life. And it describes here, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. And this is brought out. One thing that's important to consider is that there are different contributions to be made in the different phases, the different stages of life. That the contributions to society vary at different stages of life. And there are periods of transition that we go through as human beings, and part of the problem, part of the dissatisfaction that many times arises is people do not properly value the contributions that can be made at different points, different periods in our life. Because it's not exactly the same contribution. Our circumstances change, and there are things that we can do and that we can't do at any period in life. Those things simply change with time. And this is brought out. There are various places that we could go to look at that in terms of the variations and contributions. It says in Proverbs 17 and verse 6, the children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. This is a proverb that, in effect, what is it that an old man takes great pride and pleasure in? Well, his grandchildren. What is it that little children take great pride and pleasure in? It's their fathers. Boy, they're as a little child, a little small child, particularly perhaps little boys, but just little children in general, are going to look up to and be proud of their fathers. Little kids will brag about things as to what what their dad can do by comparison to somebody else's dad, and there's that description here. There is a different focus that we have in life. And of course our circumstances are different. When someone is young, at the time when physical strength is in its prime, and there are things that can be done and should be done. As a person gets older, he grows in experience, and yet physical strength, after a period of time, peaks, levels out, and eventually begins to diminish. But experience and lessons that are learned continue to grow and to increase. And there are differences in terms of what we're able to do and what we're able to contribute. Paul addresses that in the book of Titus, chapter 2, where he talks about establishment of society, and he said, here is Paul addressed Titus, he said, you speak the things which are conducive to sound doctrine. That the aged men, the older men, be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, and in love, and in patience. So here was to be an example of being alert, of being self-controlled, having a certain dignity and self-restraint. Here were characteristics that were to be exemplified as age advanced. The older women also, that they be in behavior as becomes holiness. Not false accusers, not given to much wine, but teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, to be chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourself a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity, sound speech that cannot be condemned. So Paul goes through and he addresses the characteristics of society and the fact that those who are older need to set an example for those who are younger. Where are young men going to learn? Where are young women going to learn? Where are you going to learn how to be properly a lady and a gentleman? That where is proper behavior and proper conduct? Where is it going to be learned? There is a role here that is described of those who are older, setting a pattern, setting an example that will distinguish, will establish proper ways of conduct, proper ways of behavior, ways of interacting with others, and things that can be learned by those who are younger. And it's a very, very important role. Job even makes reference to it, or it's referred to in the book of Job, in Job chapter 12, where it says in Job 12:12, with the ancient is wisdom, and in length of days understanding. I've made comment before that one of the hallmarks of maturity is understanding the cause and effect relationship. And the reason for that is the fact that to properly appreciate and connect cause and effect requires a certain degree of experience. You know, when someone is very young, they may see causes and they may see effects, but you know, sometimes the connection between cause and effect can be 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years. Every cause doesn't produce its effect immediately. Mr. Alvarado addressed the subject of diet in the sermonette, and he talked about the long-term health consequences of eating unclean foods, eating unclean meat, pork in particular. Now, you know, certain foods, particularly certain plants, people are aware that's poison. The reason they're aware that it's poison is because the cause and effect, it doesn't take very long to connect it. You know, you sit down and you eat something that is a poisonous plant, and you're going to get sick immediately. You know, if you were to try to make a salad out of poison ivy, it wouldn't wouldn't take you very long before you would start connecting cause and effect. That cause and effect with plants tends to be very quick. If you eat something that's poisonous, it tends to make you sick very quickly. However, in terms of animals, in terms of meat, the cause and effect is still there, but the impact is not as immediate. You know, you can sit down and eat a ham sandwich and you don't just keel over dead the next moment. Now, if you were to sit down and eat, a plate of arsenic, you probably would. You see, many effects are connected with their cause only over a period of time. And over a period of time, observations can be made, and you can eventually arrive at conclusions, but many of those causes and effects may be only connected over a period of time of years, some shorter, some longer. Young people can look around and they can see causes and they can see effects, but they lack the experience to connect some of these things together and to see why certain things lead to this result. One of the things that age and experience gives is a time of observation and a time of seeing, whether by observation or in some cases by being involved in it yourself, that there are consequences, there are effects that come from certain causes. Now, those who are older have the basis, if they have been studying God's Word, they have the advantage of seeing what God says and of being able to observe over a period of years the practical results and consequences of both obedience and disobedience, because they've seen it over a period of years in their own lives and in the lives of others. When you lack that experience, you simply do not have the practical level of experience of putting it all together and connecting it. Now, you can take somebody else's word for it, you can believe it or understand it on a certain academic level. There may be things you refrain from because you respect and honor the individual who told you to refrain from it, and so out of honor and deference to them you do, even though you don't fully see the connection. As years pass and as you observe the lives of others who did not have that respect and that deference, you see the consequences in their lives, and eventually you understand why. Because as you gain in experience. So, we're told that with the ancient is wisdom, and in length of days, understanding. That's certainly the way that it ought to be. And there is an experience that is gained over a lifetime of living life. And God places value on that. Certain lessons. We can start further up the ladder. You know, it's like nobody has to climb the ladder. God didn't intend that we have to climb the ladder from the bottom to the top, because you can't climb that far. But one climbs up a certain level, and the next starts from that point and climbs a little further. In every generation, in a society properly ordered, and then certainly in the world tomorrow, in the millennium, when God's government is holding sway, each generation will be able to climb a little further. But you see, we start where we start as a result and as the basis of those who've gone before. One of the reasons to show honor and respect is that this is the basis of the start that we've had in life. The opportunities, the benefit, the level of experience and of learning, that's there. The contributions to society can vary at different stages of life, but human beings have the ability to accumulate experience because we have a language that can be spoken. We can write down, we can read the experiences of others. We can draw on not simply our own experience of however many years we've lived. We can draw on the experience of others who've lived, both of our contemporaries and those of our predecessors. Our parents and grandparents, from whom maybe we can hear it firsthand, and of generations before that, of whom we can simply read the written record. And so there's an opportunity to accumulate experience, to see where certain things lead, both for good and for bad. We have the opportunity to operate on accumulated experience. So we don't all have to simply reinvent the wheel. We don't have to go back to square one and every generation start over from scratch. You know, how would you like to have to do that? We look and when we come on the scene, you know, there are all sorts of things that are built, that are here. There are buildings that are built, there are homes, there are roads, there are inventions, and automobiles, all sorts of things we take for granted. You know, you weren't simply dropped down in the middle of a prairie or the middle of a jungle or the middle of something cut off from every other human invention. No, everything is built on something else. You know, somebody built what we see. They came on the scene and they had certain things and they started from where they were and they built more. And it is a cumulative matter. Now let's look a little bit about God's design for old age. Why did God design something such as the aging process? Because the aging process is certainly that's something that we go through and that we experience. Why did God design it that way? You know, He could have designed things different ways that are vastly different. But this is what God has designed. You know, one of the things that we often think of in connection of old age, one of the things that is most commonly noticed and associated with getting older has to do with our hair changing its color. Going gray, going white. Now, you know, just stop and think about that for a minute. I mean, God could have designed various things. That's the way He designed it to be. I understand some people, gray more quickly. Some start graying earlier. Some go completely white with their hair. Others may have very little left to go white. Some people gray much less than others do. I understand that. But traditionally, one of the things that is associated most frequently with getting older has to do with a change of hair color. Now, why is that what changes? I mean, God didn't make your skin color to change. Didn't make your eye color to where that changes. Various other things. I mean, He could have designed different things that would change, but He made the hair to change, and it changes in a particular direction. It doesn't start off, start changing color to suddenly get red or to get black or to get brown. Now, I know sometimes it does, but that's not as a result of something God has done. But in Proverbs 16:31 it says, "The hoary head," which means the white hair, "is a crown of glory if it be found in the way of righteousness." A hoary head is a crown of glory if it be found in the way of righteousness. Now here it is talking about the fact of someone who is older, who has white hair, and it says that should be looked upon as a crown of glory if it's found in the way of righteousness. If here is a person who has accumulated wisdom and who has accumulated wisdom, who has accumulated experience, who is living a godly life and setting a godly example, that those years of living and of experience are something that ought to be honored, and to see someone who has lived and has survived that time and is found in the way of righteousness is setting a right and a positive example, that white hair ought to be looked upon as a crown of glory. That's something of honor. Now, why is that? Again, why white hair? Why did God pick out white hair? I mean, He could have picked out some other color. If He wanted to make your hair change color as a sign of aging, He could have picked out some other color combination, that it all started off one color and changed to something else. But He picked out that people might start off in life, they may start out with hair that is black or brown or red or blonde. They may start out with various colors early in life, but the tendency among all nationalities, all races, is the fact that it all heads in the same direction. Now, that's sort of interesting when you think about it, that God designed it that way. He built in a lot of variation and variety in human beings in a variety of different ways, but in terms of the color of hair, that is something that as people grow older, there is a greater similarity. They grow more similar in that way. Now, one thing that ties in with that, I think something sort of interesting, is found back in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 9. Daniel says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, picturing here the overthrow of the beast power, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. Now here it pictures the establishment of the kingdom of God, and God is called here the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days, and it talks about the head of his hair like pure wool. Now what does that mean? Well, specifically it's a reference to color. That's made plain back in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 14, where it refers here to Jesus Christ in glory. It says, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. So it describes God the Father and Jesus Christ as having hair that's white like wool, as white as snow. Isn't it interesting that one of the things that God designed as a physical sign of the aging process is that we take on outwardly a characteristic that more and more resembles the appearance of God? Now, what's taking place outwardly, physically, was designed as an outward reminder of what ought to be taking place inwardly, because all you have to do is live long enough and the aging process will take place. But there's something that ought to take place inwardly as we grow older, because as we grow older, we ought to become more like God, regardless of how we started out in life, where we started out, that we all start out at different places, but we ought to grow in a direction that takes us toward God. And God even designed something in the physical creation. That's something that animals don't go through in the same way. I know, a dog or a horse or various animals may show a little bit of gray or white around their muzzle, but that's not. There's not a complete change of color that takes place that, as is characteristic very often with human beings if they live long enough. So here's something that God designed. It's just a little minor thing, you can say, in the overall scheme of things, but I think there is something there for us to learn. There is a principle that God designed human beings as they live longer to become more like Him, to take on more of His characteristics, to reflect more of Him. So, just as one of the characteristics of aging is represented by a change of the color of our hair. Another characteristic of aging has to do with a decrease in physical stamina. That physically we just aren't quite what we used to be. Physical stamina and physical life were designed as temporary. And God designed it in that there's an aging process, that physical strength decreases. You know, physical strength and size grows, it reaches a peak, it levels out, and eventually it begins to decrease. And I understand that diet and exercise and various things can certainly make us more healthy and can sustain physical energy levels better for a longer period of time. And that's right and appropriate to be careful of your diet and to try to take care of ourselves in that way. But I don't care how good your diet is, and I don't care how much you exercise, you're not going to maintain yourself at the peak where you were when you were 25 or 30. You're just simply not. There comes a point when you may be in better physical shape than somebody else that's your age. You may even be in better physical shape than some who are younger, because you take care of yourself and try to follow God's laws of health. But as we get older, there is going to be a decrease in physical stamina, because physical life was designed as temporary. Physical life is not the ultimate. And that's, of course, sometimes hard for young people to see and to realize. Physical life is not the ultimate. But you see, when you look at earlier periods of life, you know, those of you who are teenagers, was age 3 the ultimate? You know, little 3-year-old boy, he can be having a great time. He's sitting down there and he's making all these sounds, and he's running his little truck around the floor, and he's making all sorts of car sounds, and he's really having a great time. Is that the ultimate? And you look at that and say, boy, you know, it just doesn't get any better. Everything is downhill from there. You want to go back? You like to be 3 again? Well, you know, every age has its advantages and disadvantages. And we ought to enjoy every point in our journey where we are. It's just like as our kids grow up, that whatever age they are is an age to enjoy them and to appreciate them and to value that age, because that age, the one thing you can say about it, that's temporary, it won't last, it's not going to endure, time will go on. They'll get older. We're told in Psalm 90 here in verse 4, "For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, as a watch in the night." On down in verse 10, "The days of our years are 70, about 70. And if by reason of strength they be 80, be 80, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it's soon cut off and we fly away." Verse 12, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." The point is that our life, whether we live to be 70 or 80 or beyond, is still temporary. It's temporary. It's not something that is going to sustain itself indefinitely. We're not self-sustaining. We have a need for something outside of ourselves. There is nothing we can do to sustain ourselves forever. Certainly, if we try to follow God's laws of health and we're careful of our diet and we try to get exercise, we apply the principles that God reveals the keys to in the Scriptures, we're going to normally be able to function better for longer. But no matter how perfectly we observe these principles, that's not a permanent solution. We grow older. We lose a certain level of stamina and strength. And ultimately we come to realize, as we look back over a period of 70 or 80 or even 90 or 100 years, that our life is like a flower. It's here, it blooms, and it fades. It's gone. It's like a breath. It's here, and it's gone. There is a need for something that comes from a source beyond us. We don't have the ability to sustain ourselves indefinitely. We're dependent upon the air that we breathe, the food and the water that we take in. You know, a matter of minutes without air, a matter of days without food and water. And this physical life simply ceases. And even with all those things, there is a physical downturn that is taken, an aging, and eventually death. And no amount of scientific progress is going to grant man eternal life. Physical stamina and life were designed to be temporary. And as a person gets older in life and begins to realize that, there should come with it an increasing awareness of our need for God and for what only God can supply. A perspective on life that focuses on what we need that comes from a source outside of ourselves. Now we're told in Ecclesiastes 12:1, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, when the evil days come not, nor your years draw near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them. God says, look, the time to think about God is not just to wait until you're old and there are all kinds of things you can't do any longer. Time to really start thinking about God is when you're young, when you have so much of the future of your physical life in front of you, because there's a lot of problems that we can save ourselves from if we have God in mind, if we're thinking about God and conscious about God and what He's doing. But age advances. Talks about it in Proverbs chapter 20. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 9, it says, the glory, verse 29, Proverbs 20, the glory of young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. You know, the glory of young men is their strength. That's what a young man glories in. He's proud of his strength, and there's God has sort of built that in. You know, even young boys, haven't even. You look at them, be 8, 9, 10 years old. Here they are trying to make muscles and look at themselves in the mirror and see how strong they are. And there's the glory of the young men glory in their strength. But the beauty of old men is the gray head. Now this has to do certainly with the accumulation of experience and wisdom that as a person advances in years, that physical strength and stamina will eventually fade. It won't be what it was at its peak. But there is an accumulation of wisdom and of experience. And as Mr. Tkach has made the statement, it's not just a matter of working harder, it's a matter of working smarter. And a lot of times that's the reason that those who are older, who've gained some experience, can do some things that they've learned how to work a little smarter. And that's important because there is an accumulation of wisdom and of experience that ought to be there. But physical stamina is not designed as something that is permanent. It talks about in Job chapter 5 and verse 26. Job 5:26, it says, you shall come to your grave in a full age, like as a shock of corn comes in his season. You come to your grave in a full age. This was what was intended as the conclusion of the matter. Physical life was designed by its very nature to be temporary. Physical life was not designed to endure forever. It was designed to be temporary. God was here talking to Abraham in Genesis 15:15. And He said, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. So, what was told Abraham, and it was told him as a positive thing. It said, Abraham, you're going to live for a long time and you will die in peace. You'll die a peaceful death, not a horrible, traumatic death, but you'll die a peaceful death. You will be buried. You're going to go back to the dust to whence all of your ancestors have gone. Physical life was designed to be temporary, because there is something beyond physical life to which we are told to aspire. God promises us the opportunity to have eternal life, to have immortal life, to live forever as a part of His family. But that's not something we possess inherently within ourselves. We can't give it to ourselves. We can't guarantee it to ourselves by some physical action. It's a gift of God. And as we age, we're reminded of that. We're reminded of our temporary nature and of the need we have for something to sustain us that comes from outside of ourselves. God designed old age as a time we were to become certainly more and more like Him, more reflective of His characteristics, just as He designed even outward manifestations of age. He designed it as a time that we were to become impressed more and more with our temporary state and the fact that of our need for Him. It was designed as a time, certainly, that respect and dignity was to be shown, because the basis of a society that has any qualities of endurance is a society that is built on respect. A society that is built on respect and on honor. Not a society that is based on brute strength. Because that's part of what separates man from the animals. A valuing of things beyond just simply what we stand in terror or fear of. And so, age, a time of diminished physical endurance and capacity and strength, was designed to be a time when greatest honor and respect was shown toward someone. Greatest honor and respect shown for those who are at a point in life that their physical strength and stamina is less. And yet the honor and the respect and the deference shown them is to be increased. That's why we're told in Leviticus 19:32, you shall rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man and fear your God. I am the eternal. A society based on respect, based on honor, showing this proper deference and respect to those who are older. You know, there are other places that again address this subject. We find in Job 32 verse 4 that Elihu had waited till Job had spoken because they were elder than he. Now, in this particular case, Elihu had what he had to say was really the most on the mark of what anybody there said, but he deferred to them out of age, because they were older than he was, and so he deferred to them. He allowed them to go first. He didn't come in as some young smart aleck know-it-all, but had an attitude of respect and of deference. In Proverbs chapter 23, in verse 22, it says, hearken unto your father that begat you, and despise not your mother when she's old. You know, listen. This is addressing even those who have grown older. It says, despise not your mother when she's old. Not just a matter of when you're a little child and she is a young woman, but there is to be a respect and a regard that carries on into old age, and that is a very, very important part of a society that has any enduring qualities. The relationship that we have certainly changes. We're no longer, as we become adults, we're no longer little children living there, being provided for and living under the the roof of and under all of the rules of a parent. But there is to be a respect and an honor and a regard and esteem that is shown. It says in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 1, "Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, and the younger as sisters, with all purity." Then it goes on, it says, "If any widow have children," or grandchildren as it should properly read, "let them learn first to show piety at home, to requite their parents what is good and acceptable before God. She that's a widow indeed and trusts in desolate, trusts God and continues in supplications and prayers day and night." Verse 8, it says, "If any provide not for his own, especially those of his own household, his own kindred, he's denied the faith and is worse than an infidel." It's talking here of relationships with those who are older. It talks about just people in general, that we should show respect and honor and deference when we address older people. Someone's old enough to be our father, we ought to entreat him as a father. We ought to show respect in that way. And, that's something that has been characteristic, certainly, I think, of our section of the country, perhaps more than most, is matters of polite respect, of using titles of respect before a person's first name, of yes sir or yes ma'am. Outward signs of respect, of civility, that are appropriate and proper. It's a custom that is certainly godly based, in that it has to do with a matter of showing outward deference and respect to those who are older. And so it talks about that as we talk to older people, to entreat them as we would a father or a mother, to show a respect that is due age. Then Timothy was told to show special honor to those who are widows. But he's told that if a widow has children or grandchildren, that they need to take primary responsibility for taking care of an elderly parent. And that a widow who is desolate, who does not have family, has to trust God. And he talks about the fact of down in verse 16, "If a man or woman that believes have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed." So in reference to the church giving financial assistance to those who are widows, those who are elderly, the instruction was that this should normally only be given when there are no family members to provide it, because if there's family there is a primary responsibility that they have, and that the church would normally provide for those who do not have family to provide for them, and that it is a family responsibility first and foremost that ought to be there, and that ought to be understood and valued, because it's an opportunity to show honor, to be able to help out and to do those things. And that's why we're told, we don't provide for our own. If we're careless and indifferent toward our own and those who are our relatives, then in effect we really denied the faith. We're not living the Christian life. If we have an indifferent attitude and are unwilling to provide for those who are our family. Now, sometimes there are circumstances where individuals are unable to do certain things, at least beyond a certain level. We have our limitations, and God's not talking about, He's not talking about unable, He's talking about unwilling. Well, there are many places that we could go, but let's just notice a little bit, and we see that age is designed as a time that carries certain outward manifestations. It certainly is a time to become more like God. It's a time that we were designed to become more conscious of our need for God. It is a time for respect and for dignity. And the description we have in the prophets of the time when the kingdom of God will hold sway on the earth reflects a society that is far different than the society of today. In Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 11, it says, "The Eternal has redeemed Jacob and ransomed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. Talking about when Christ returns and our people are brought back from captivity. Therefore they'll come and sing in the height of Zion. They'll flow together to the goodness of the Lord, for wheat and for wine and for oil and for the young of the flock and of the herd. And their souls shall be as a watered garden, and they shall not sorrow any more at all. Then shall the virgin rejoice in the dance, both young men and old together. For I'll turn their mourning into joy and will comfort them and make them rejoice from their sorrow. Here it describes a society that has unity. It talks about people, young and old, rejoicing together. And it talks about, in our culture again, music has become a very divisive factor along generational lines. Music has become a divisive factor in our culture and our society. God never intended it to be such. God intended music to have a unifying effect, and certainly, again, this was far more characteristic in times past. Many of you can remember back years ago, community activities or community dances, and everybody from the young to the old were there and enjoyed the same thing. And they all had a good time and they rejoiced together. And that is characteristic of the world tomorrow. That's what it's going to be like then. It's not going to be everybody walking around with a set of plugs in their ears, tuned in to their, to their own thing. It's going to be that they'll rejoice together, young men and old together. Psalm 148 talks about an attitude toward God, praising God. Psalm 148 in verse 12, it says, both young men and maidens, old men and children, let them praise the name of the Eternal, for His name alone is excellent. His glory is above the earth and the heavens. Both young men and maidens, old men and children. Everybody, the whole society, the whole culture. Let's just notice one final place in the book of Zechariah, chapter 8. Zechariah chapter 8 and verse 3. Thus says the Eternal, I am returned unto Zion and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem shall be called a city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. Thus says the Eternal of hosts, there shall yet old men and old women dwell in the streets of Jerusalem, and every man with his staff in his hand for very age. And the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the streets thereof. Thus says the Lord of hosts, if it be a marvelous in the eyes of the remnant of this people in these days, should it be also marvelous in my eyes, says the Lord? I'll save my people, and I'll bring them, verse 8, and they'll dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and they'll be my God, and they'll be my people, and I'll be their God in truth and in righteousness. Old men and old women there. Some cases, as it describes, every man with his staff in his hand for very age. Little boys, little girls playing, elderly people walking in peace. Today you walk down the streets of the city and who knows what's going to happen. May get knocked in the head. Somebody will come up and rob you or try to take what you have. We live in a society and a culture that is a far cry from what's described right here in the book of Zechariah. But when the government of God holds sway over all the earth, honor and respect is not simply going to be equated with a card once a year. Our society does not have a proper attitude toward the elderly or toward the aging process. Quick telephone call on Mother's Day or Father's Day, card. That's not what honor is all about. Certainly, those things can be included in honor, but we have to realize that honor has to do with a society that is not self-based. And we need to learn to exemplify godly values in the midst of a selfish society, realizing that what we have described is the basis of a society that has stability and endurance, a society that learns and appreciates the value of respect and of honor. We live in a culture that has increasingly thrown these concepts away. But they're a part of recapturing true values, and they ought to characterize us. They ought to characterize us in the way that we deal with one another. They ought to characterize us in the way that we deal in the community at large, and certainly in the context of our own families. because it is a very vitally important concept, one that underlies the whole sense of community, society, and civilization, and that will be the basis of reordering an entire society, reestablishing an entire culture in the world tomorrow.